Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Colonel Pat Saber. I'm the Chief of OCPA's Media Relations Division, and it is an honor to moderate today's press conference. Shortly we'll have Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Eric Fanning, and Chief of Staff of the Army, General Mark Milley, here for today's press conference. They'll both open up with a brief opening statement, and followed by an opportunity to ask questions, which I will moderate from this podium. We're ready. Yes, sir.
They always tell us where to sit. Makes the job easier.
I'll now turn the floor over to Secretary Fanning.
Hosting us this week. At no other time in the year do so many of the Army's people, regular Army, civilian, Guard, Reserve, and our industry partners come together for meetings to discuss the Army. As Secretary, I've taken as many opportunities as I can to get out of the Pentagon for my own morale, more than anything, and see soldiers and civilians doing what they do, where they do it, and if they'll allow me to do it with them. My travels have spanned 4 continents, from training exercises with NATO allies in Poland to engaging with some of the more than 100,000 men and women in the Pacific. I've seen firsthand how much we ask of our soldiers, our civilians, and their families. And as I saw personally last month, our soldiers are front and center in 2 theaters of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each trip confirmed that today's Army is at an inflection point. The Army is responsible for an increasingly diverse set of missions, and for a period of many years, we've had to focus our resources on current needs. With the rise of Russian aggression, challenges to stability in the Pacific, and the fight against ISIL, there are even greater demands on our force. The Army is at the center of confronting each of our nation's enduring security challenges. To meet our priorities and to carry our responsibilities across the world, the Army has to modernize and realign. For instance, I visited Fort Hood this past summer, where soldiers and civilians are working in maintenance facilities that were built in the 1950s and 60s. They have significant shortages of space, and the facility doors are not even wide enough for modern vehicles, forcing them to work outside. These facilities also lack the electrical and communications infrastructure to support maintenance of M1, M2, Paladin, and Stryker vehicles. Across our force, we have soldiers and civilians living and working in 52,000 buildings that are in poor or failing conditions because of the $7 billion in deferred maintenance that we've aggregated over the last few years. Since 2011, the Army's modernization program has decreased by approximately 33%. That's the base budget. And today our modernization program is about $36 billion less than the next closest service. These are the kinds of costs and trade-offs we've made over the past several years to meet our current responsibilities. While we can't completely control the amount of resources we receive, we can ensure we make more efficient use of what we have. This requires that we draw more effectively from some of our nation's greatest sources of strength, our dynamic industries and culture of innovation. Much of that necessitates making improvements in how we interact with and engage our partners in industry. This conference is a prime opportunity to exchange ideas and develop more effective approaches to modernizing our force so that we can meet our priorities and prepare for the future. I've seen how nimble and adaptive our soldiers and civilians can be. My responsibility as Secretary of the Army is to ensure that we have that same capability institutionally and how we are organized and aligned to support their missions. As we build on the steps we have already taken to modernize our force, I look forward to working with General Milley as we build on that progress and strengthen our Army. And I look forward to your questions. Chief.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. And let me just make a couple of brief comments. Last year, we talked significantly about readiness, readiness being number one. There is no other one. And we've made good progress over the last year in terms of readiness. But we're not there yet as an Army on where we need to be to deal with the multiple and varied challenges that we anticipate in the near future. But having said that, this year What Secretary and I want to emphasize at this particular AUSA is the future of our Army, the deeper future, modernization and future concepts, et cetera. It is my belief as the Chief of Staff of the Army, after a year of close and rigorous study as the Chief, but even before that, as a career as a soldier, that we're on the cusp of a fundamental change in the character of ground warfare. We're probably this side, maybe 5-10 years this side of that actual fundamental change. And we, the American Army, we, the U.S. Army, we don't have to get it exactly right, but we've got to get it less wrong than any potential adversary if we're going to prevail in the next war. The Army will be essential to the conduct of any conflict, and our task is to prepare that Army for that potential future conflict. And that'll be a focus item for the Secretary, for myself, and for all of the senior leaders of the United States Army, and indeed throughout the entire institution, is to prepare our Army for tomorrow so that we have readiness for tomorrow. Up until now, we have essentially mortgaged future readiness or modernization for current readiness. And we've got to continue our emphasis on current readiness because those threats are real, they're here, they're now. But at the same time, we've got to do more to pick the pace up in terms of our future readiness, which is our modernization programs, to make sure our Army's in balance years to come. So thanks for that, and look forward to your questions. Thank AUSA for hosting this. I think it's a great event, once a year event, and we're very appreciative of them doing this on behalf of all of us. So look forward to your questions. And Sydney, you can't ask any questions. Just kidding, Sydney.
Thank you, gentlemen. As we are on the schedule today, when called upon, each journalist will have an opportunity to ask one question and one follow-up. And we're going to start off with Ellen Mitchell from Politico.
Okay. Politico's not here.
All right.
That's good, because I don't answer any
That was an
political
easy
questions.
All right, Tony Cappuccio from Bloomberg.
A couple questions on force structure. There's been, one of the presidential candidates has suggested the Army needs 540,000 active duty. It's about 65,000 more than you have now. Is there a valid requirement for 540,000 active duty? Does your deep dive into the future show that? And what would be the cost implication of adding 65,000 straight up and then the sustainment cost over several years? And a quick second, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 3 or 4 years about the Army is on a path to be the smallest since before World War II. Is that a valid benchmark in which to judge the needs for Army force structure improvement?
Defer to the Secretary if you want, or I can take it either or.
I want you to start.
Well, to answer your second question first, on is the smallest since World War II a valid benchmark? It's a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. The idea of throwing out numbers and relative comparisons to World War II is more of a metaphor than a specific number. World War II, we had an 8 million soldier army by 1945. We had 90 divisions or 89 divisions. Of course, prior to the war, we had very few. So the metaphor refers to the age-old tradition of the United States relying on a rapid mobilization at the beginning of a war in order to build up the force structure, the combat power to prevail in the war. And that has worked for the vast majority of time throughout our history, but it's worked at great cost, so that in the first battles of wars gone by, we have usually suffered significant casualties, in my mind unnecessary, because of unpreparedness, both in size and capability, training, types of equipment modernization. So that's kind of what that is referring to. I don't think anyone is suggesting, and certainly not us, suggesting a multi-million, 8 million person army, 90 million. We're not doing any of that. So in that regard, the actual numbers are irrelevant, and then the reference is more metaphorical. The other part of it that is misleading, that can be misleading when you start comparing things to World War I and World War II, is capabilities. An M1 tank, for example, today is significantly more capable than a Sherman tank of World War II. Arguably, a platoon of M1s, 4 M1 tanks, could arguably defeat Patton's Third Army with hundreds of M4 tanks. So the quantity versus the quality argument, when you start talking World War II versus today, it gets a little bit silly to be actually correct about that. Same thing in the Air Force. The number of munitions that can be dropped from a modern aircraft today and the precision and the effects they deliver fundamentally different than squadrons of B-17s and B-24s in World War II. So I don't necessarily find it particularly helpful in analysis of actual force structure. Now, with regard to the number, you mentioned, I think, 540. Yes, we do all kinds of studies. We do a lot of analysis. We do a lot of rigor. I'm not going to share those numbers because it's not about so much numbers as it's about capabilities. And what we need to make sure is we have the most capable Army to deliver specific effects on a battlefield relative to U.S. national security interests. I don't publicly discuss specific numbers. I'll try to avoid it because it can be unhelpful and it depends on which way you're looking at it and how many of this and how many of that, and people can turn those things into a lot of different ways. So we do a lot of studies. We have lots of varied numbers on exact requirements. Yes, we do have that, and the key question is, that number X, for what? What is it you want to do? What is the requirement, the national security requirement? What does it say in the defense planning guidance, et cetera? And those will vary depending on the contingencies that you are looking at.
I think just maybe to double tap on this in a slightly different way. Numbers are just one way to measure the effectiveness of the Army, and lots of things get lost in that conversation when we just talk about force structure, 540, 450, 480, 490, whatever number that is, which, by the way, is the active component number, not the total force number. But one of the dangers that we see, because this debate's taking place in a number of different ways, would be the Army told to maintain a force structure greater than what we're planning on without any additional resource to do that. That would put us out of whack in other areas. Our modernization investments are down, as I said. We're trying to get our readiness up. And if we had to maintain a larger force structure without additional resource, it would further unbalance the program that we have for the Army.
We got Dan Wasserby from Janes.
So the Mobile Protected Firepower Program, I know it's still coming together for a light tank or medium tank. Acquisition plan and all that's still sort of being formulated, and you can make a pretty good case for why you need it. But what has changed in the last few years? Why will the Army be successful in buying this when so many of the more recent combat vehicle development programs have not resulted in anything being fielded? What are you guys going to do oversight-wise, I guess, to make this successul?
I'll take the last half of your question first, and then the Chief can talk about the requirement. We did go through a period of problematic acquisition programs. No one would dispute that. A lot of work has been done in the acquisition community, organizationally, processes, training, what have you, to improve. And our budget's substantially smaller than it used to be as well, so it's an unfortunate benefit of that, I suppose, is it's easier to oversee. But the Army's done a lot of work institutionally to build upon and learn from the lessons of those failed programs. Many of which weren't delivered, is true, but they did deliver capabilities that we've rolled into other strategic acquisition programs.
In terms of requirement, within the Army, there's a couple of different basic fundamental types of units. You got mechanized Bradley type, mechanized infantry Bradley type, along with armor Abrams. And then you've got light infantry that can be delivered by airborne parachute, light infantry that can be delivered by helicopter, air assault, 101st Airborne Division, and straight light infantry like the 10th Mountain Division as an example. And then you've got Stryker, which is sort of a little bit in between there, and they actually have a tremendous amount of infantry. But what is needed, especially for the lighter units, is a mobile capability that can go toe-to-toe with your higher-end potential adversaries and survive. And that's really what mobile protected firepower is all about. And it's the ability to have a capability that can be rapidly deployable from a continental base, can operate expeditionary, and when it gets on the ground, it has tactical mobility, survivability, and lethality. Those are its fundamental requirements. And if you think of just a little phrase, shoot, move, communicate, protect, that sort of sums up a lot of what armies have to do. So that system will have lethality, that system will have excellent mobility at a weight that's deployable, rapidly deployable across oceans, and it'll have protection against a variety of enemy munitions. That'll be increasingly important.
Sydney.
I'm asking a question.
Sydney, it's so good to see you.
Pardon me. Sydney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Here I am. I'm loud enough on my own, really, but thank you. Loudly. As you talk about refocusing on the future, on some of these new threats that we are looking at, as opposed to our traditional focus or recent focus on the counterinsurgency wars, is there a new defining mission or concept, the way the Army had the folded gap for so many years, and then we had a sort of confusing period, then we had counterinsurgency. General Odierno had strategic land power, never quite got traction. Now we're hearing from TRADOC about multi-domain battle, which has some echoes in your remarks as well. Is there a big idea that while the Army has many missions that are important, is driving the priorities as the big thing the Army must do non-negotiable?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. First, we've got, as we look towards the future, we've got to maintain and sustain the counterinsurgency, counterterrorist capabilities that we've developed and refined to a high level of expertise over the last 15 years of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. And we have excellent capability, world-class, second to none, capability to fight terrorists and to fight in a counterinsurgency environment. And that has been learned and adapted over 15 years. We have to sustain that. We can't not keep going with that capability. We have to sustain it, maintain it, keep the people, the equipment, the organizations, and keep that going. But at the same time, we have to develop the capability to be able to present the president with options, our president with options, in the event of potential conflict with a higher end threat, a near peer competitor. So we have to be able to do both of those simultaneously. Now, as I mentioned up front, I believe that the character, not the nature of war, but the character of war is undergoing some fundamental change, and specifically the character of ground war is undergoing fundamental change. So the domains of war, space, cyber, air, sea, and land, land forces in the future are going to have to be able to be capable and to operate in all of those domains. Hence, what you've heard out of TRADOC or some of my speeches about multi-domain battle. So we used to have air-land battle, 2 domains. Then there was developed, by the Navy and Air Force, air-sea battle, 2 domains. In reality, joint forces, specifically land forces, are going to have to be able to operate effectively in all domains simultaneously. In addition to that, you're going to have to be able to operate that in those domains against a near-peer, high-end threat. And that's the capability that we are pacing ourselves against, if that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Brennan.
Your face doesn't look like it answered your question, Sidney.
I could take over the press conference, keep asking you that, but I think I might be able to finish. Thank you.
No, go ahead. You got a follow-on question, go ahead.
So how does
I mean, you went to Harvard, so I want to flesh this out for you.
thank you. how does that drive investment priorities? Because of course, ultimately, everything can't be a priority. You have to sacrifice some things. So if coin must be preserved and we must develop this new capability, where do we get the resources to build a new capability?
Okay, no, fair enough. Okay, so think in terms of time for a second. You've got the immediate, the readiness, right, of the current existing force with legacy weapon systems, legacy organizations, legacy doctrine. The fact of the matter is that organization, the Army as you see it today, you go out to a post, camp, or station, that's going to be around, 3, 4, 5 years from now. We're not talking, changing that in the next, it'll be changed at the margins, but it's not going to be overwhelmingly changed, right? And these systems are going to also be around probably out to about 10 years from now. You're still going to have helicopters and tanks and Bradleys and that stuff. But when I'm talking about fundamental change in the character of ground warfare, I'm talking beyond 10 years, 10, 15 years and beyond. That's where you're going to see some very fundamental change. And the investment for those years is S&T, research development, and what we're doing is in accordance with a set of priorities that the Secretary outlined in his speech just a little while ago, in order to explore opportunities in that time frame that once we believe that they're fleshed out, we've prototyped some of them, that they have some promise. Robotics would be an example. There's no question in my mind robotics are going to play a significant role in ground warfare in the late 2020s and 2030s. There's no doubt in my mind. So the research development S&T is ongoing, and we have to invest in that in order to determine how much of that is going to apply to the American Army.
Brennan.
Brendan McGarry, military.com. I had a question for the Secretary and the Chief. Mr. Secretary, you just announced this summer a new initiative for rapid equipping. Can you talk a little bit about what you're aiming for there, what types of gear? I mean, obviously there's been any number of rapid equipping offices and efforts over the past more than a decade. So it'd be helpful to hear more your thoughts about what specifically you want to do there. And then for the Chief, General, you have talked about in the past, you've been very candid with some of your frustrations about acquisition. You have any number of programs, but I know you singled out the modular handgun system. Can you talk a little bit about any updates there about MHS, and then also sort of how you see some of these lessons learned unfolding in that effort and others as you go forward? Thank you.
So first on the Rapid Capabilities Office, it's different than the Rapid Equipping Force. That's set up to get pretty much things off the shelf or maybe slightly modified out to the force in under 180 days. The Rapid Capabilities Office sort of fills a gap between that and our normal acquisition programs of record to try and accelerate targeted capabilities and sort of deliver in the 1 to 5 year window. What we're seeing is, as we build towards the Army of the future, that adversaries are iterating more quickly, technology is iterating more quickly, and we can't continue to modernize in the way that we always have in the past. We have to find some ways, even as we are building large programs of record, to get technology and capability into the hands of soldiers faster than we're doing right now because the adversary is doing it. And we really set that office up with, based on emerging needs that are coming from combatant commanders in the field that are telling us we have a problem with this capability or our overmatch is diminishing and that capability, and that will be the focus of this office. The Chief and I will formalize the first activities out of this office by November 1st, I imagine, if they keep up on the schedule that they're on. With the idea being, again, to bring forward capabilities that maybe we have already in programs we're working on, other services have, we see in industry. The example I use is a helicopter. We're not going to use this office. This office isn't meant to be a workaround with the traditional acquisition programs of record. It's meant to link into them. There may be a capability on the helicopter that we need to get out faster and integrate into existing helicopters. And then whatever we do with it in the Rapid Capabilities Office and as we field it will inform that longer strategic program of record as well. But it is different to your question. It's not rapid equipping, it's rapid capabilities.
And on the, you asked for an update on the modular handgun. I'm not going to do that right now, and the reason is because where it's at in the process and all this. I'll just let that one settle, but I'm confident as Chief of Staff of the Army that it's on the right track, and more to follow in due time. But I'm comfortable now, as opposed to whatever it was a year ago or a little bit less than a year ago. On the broader issue, frustration, yeah, there's still a lot of frustration out there, not only on me, but on the part of most of us in uniform, many of the service chiefs, et cetera. And I think not just us in uniform, I think a lot of the civilian workers, et cetera. So you've just got a very large process that is very, bureaucratic, and there's a reason why it's bureaucratic, is because a lot of mistakes have been made in the past for different reasons. So now there's checks upon double checks, triple checks. It takes 21 or 30 signatures or something sometimes before it ever gets to the Secretary of the Army or to me. So that's problematic. And then it's still very slow. The lead times is very slow. So that's one of the reasons why the Secretary has initiated the Rapid Capabilities Office, which is a wonderful initiative, and it's got the full support of all of us. I think it's great. But the system left to its own devices is, in fact, frustrating, slow, complicated, complex, and I believe delivers product late to need to the soldiers. And it's not designed for the world we are now entering. The commercial sector produces things at a much more rapid pace, and our adversaries are doing the same. So we need to pick the pace up. There's a bunch of steps have been put forward by Congress, by the Secretary of Defense, and others to reform, modify, change the acquisition system in order to bring it into the current times to deliver what we need, when we need it, and in the quantities and at a cost point or price point that's acceptable to the taxpayer, and give them the best bang for the buck, so to speak.
All right, we have time for one final question. Yes, sir. Right there, blue coat. You. No, sir, in the blue coat.
Hi, Scott Massioni, Federal News Radio. Both of you talked about the importance of having talent in the military. At the same time, you're drawing down, and as the center of mass gets smaller, I think you, General Milley, have seen this. You were on a panel with a Rhodes Scholar who had missed his promotion board. How are you making sure, as you're drawing down, that you're retaining the right talent and that you're not skipping over these really important people? So I guess my question is, what are you prioritizing in your military, especially going into the future, and what skills?
Well, I think it's not just prioritizing and making sure as we draw down that we keep the right people. I think we have to get more creative along the lines of Secretary Carter's Force of the Future initiatives at making sure that we find ways to capitalize and access the best talent and ideas that maybe aren't going to be in the uniformed military or in the civil service. And that's a part of what the Rapid Capabilities Office is intended to do by breaking down some of those barriers we've put in place to interact with industry, with the public sector, universities, and so forth. And so I think we've got to get more creative at how we do business and how open we are to engagement, interaction with entities, organizations, people outside the traditional military and the civil service. Going back to the frustrations of the acquisition process, it is bureaucratic. Bureaucracies are additive by nature. Something bad happens and you create a process to prevent it from happening again, and you layer that upon another one, upon another one, upon another one, and you don't really have a process to cull through all that and simplify it. And so we've tried to squeeze, we're trying to squeeze all the risk out of the process, and a lot of technological development today is based on experimentation, prototyping, even early failures. And so as we draw down, we not only need to focus on making sure we have the right people in the force, whatever size it is, but that we are opening up the institution, the bureaucracy, to doing business in a different way.
A couple of things as we look to the future about talent management. The future operating environment against a near-peer higher-end threat is going to be intensely lethal, the likes of which the United States Army has not, or the United States military, has not experienced in 70 years, since World War II. Very, very lethal. It is likely to be nonlinear, and it is likely to be on a non-contiguous battlefield. And your opponent is not only going to be competent, but it's going to be elusive and ambiguous. And you're going to fight, I believe anyway, in a widely dispersed formations. So nonlinear, distributed, widely dispersed. And I think you are going to have to do that in a degraded electronic warfare and cyber environment, where all of the systems that we've been building for years, the networks, the GPS, the PNT systems, et cetera, are going to be degraded. And it's going to put a premium on decentralized operations. Now, we talk about that all the time. We say mission tactics and Auftragtaktik and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, we still practice centralized, top-down, orders-driven type operations. I don't think that method of training our soldiers will prevail in a future conflict against a near-peer competitor. Not on a dispersed, highly lethal, distributed, non-linear battlefield where decentralized operations are going to be at a premium. So what does that mean for leaders then? Our leaders then are going to have to be self-starters. They're going to have maximum amounts of initiative. They're going to have critical thinking skills well beyond what we normally think of today in our formation. They're going to have huge amounts of character so that they make the right moral and ethical choices in the absence of supervision under intense pressure of combat. They're going to have a level of mental and organizational agility that is not necessarily current in any army, really, but to that level, we're going to have that. And I would argue that the level of endurance of these individuals is going to have to be something that we have not hitherto been training on a regular basis, where individuals are going to have to be conducting small unit independent operations without higher levels of supervision. And they're going to have to do that day in and day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, for a long time. And the last thing is these leaders are going to have to be able to operate. We, senior leaders, are going to have to implicitly trust supported leaders' judgment because of the degraded environment, you are not going to have control of subordinate operations in the true sense of the word as we think today. Push-to-talk control, we have voice or digital communications back and forth because it's going to be degraded. So these leaders are going to have to be independent, be able to operate correctly in accordance with the vision, independent of higher day-to-day instructions. I just described for you talent management and leader development that is fundamentally different than that which almost any army undertakes today. Now, I'm talking about an army in the field 15, 20, 25 years from now. I'm not talking about next week. But that's where we're going to have to go in terms of talent management and leader development. And that'll be a high bar, high standard to meet.
Are your promotion boards now for
Well,
guys you're putting on when they do that?
we do. I mean, we reward initiative and agility and critical thinking and moral character and we do all that now. I mean, but I'm talking an order of magnitude, fundamental differences here. Where organizations are operating independent of higher supervision and yet still achieving a common goal and achieving a common effect, but you may not be controlling them in the true sense of the word of what we think of the word control. Because that battlefield of the future is going to be very dispersed, disaggregated, distributed, and you may or may not have effective communication, electronic communications. And I'm talking against a near-peer type competitor. The probability that those operations will be in urban areas, for example, is very, very high, given the rates of urbanization. And urban battlefields automatically compartment you into small penny packets of forces. So, but it'll put a premium on the type of leadership that I just described, in my view.
Secretary Fanning, General Milley, thank you both for your participation with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our press conference. Thank you for attending.